This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to journalist Colin Freeman, and he's going to be telling us everything we needed to know about armed piracy, so militancy on the seas. Not always political militancy, but militancy for financial gain, conflict nonetheless. Colin himself was actually kidnapped by pirates at one point, and he's been covering this beat for years. He knows about the paramilitaries that help out the sailors. He knows about the pirate groups that give kickbacks to militant, sometimes jihadist groups. He's going to explain it all to us. If you like what we're doing here, please consider supporting Popular Front at patreon.com/popularfront. Maybe just give us an idea of where global piracy is at the moment.
Well, as of about 10 years ago, when I first started covering piracy, it was mainly off the coast of Somalia and extending out into the Indian Ocean. And there was a lot of hijackings between the years of about 2008 to 12. Then after that, the Somali piracy pretty much got stamped out, and it was pretty simple as to why. Most of the ships that were sailing in the Indian Ocean at the time eventually just decided that they were going to start carrying armed guards, and that pretty much stamped the problem out there. The reason they hadn't done prior to that was because insurers were generally a bit wary of having armed guards on ship. They were worried about legal ramifications if someone got killed, and also problems about people coming at different ports carrying weapons and so on and so forth. So the Somali piracy has pretty much died out, but where it is now big is off the coast of West Africa. Somalia being on the east side of Africa, for those of you listeners who aren't that familiar with the geography. It's resurged in West Africa, not quite at the same level, but very much the same business model of attacking ships and increasingly taking the crew hostage rather than just robbing the ship. It's not quite as bad as what we see in Somalia at the moment, but it's certainly on the rise, and it's got a lot of people worried within the shipping industry.
Maybe give us an idea then of what does piracy actually entail? It's not just jumping on board ships and stuff like that. There's a lot more to it. What is piracy then in 2021?
Well, in the old days, if you imagine your sort of classic pirates of old, you Blackbeards and Captain Teachers from the Elizabethan period, cruising around the Caribbean or wherever, you would imagine them typically getting on a ship and basically robbing the crew or forcing them to join the pirates themselves, or just killing them and then nicking whatever treasure they had on board. What has changed these days, certainly, and this is very true since Somalia, was that the pirates didn't tend to rob the ships. That was not the main thing, robbing the ship of the cargo. Partly because if you board a big tanker carrying perhaps 100,000 tons of cement or something like that, who are you going to sell 100,000 tons of stolen cement to? It's not that easy. What they do instead is they take the crew hostage. And once you've got a crew hostage, especially if you're floating off the coast of somewhere like Somalia, which 10 years ago was certainly pretty lawless, nobody is going to come and try and interfere. There was no functioning police or navy or coast guard off the Somali coast. So once you've got a crew of sailors and you've got guns pointed at their head, you can demand a ransom, and pretty much no one is going to be able to interfere with that. So that's the essential difference, really, is that in the modern day, piracy is a lot more about stealing people, taking hostages, rather than just stealing cargo. Robbery will take place as well. They will rob crews of their possessions and valuables if there's anything worth nicking. But the real money is in the ransoms. And during the Somali piracy crisis, for example, ransom started off at a few $100,000, and gradually they went up and up and up until the last few ships that got hijacked, they were getting ransoms of anything up to 10 or $12 million at a time, which is a lot of money.
Jesus, yeah, that is a lot of money. I mean, even 100,000 in Somalia you might as well be a millionaire. You know what I'm saying? Who's paying these ransoms? Like, how are they managing to be this successful with it?
Well, in the case of the Somali piracy 10 or 15 years ago, they were targeting where they could international shipping. Ships that were insured, owned by European or American or Asian businesses. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them had what's known as kidnap and ransom insurance, which means that if your ship gets taken, it gets hijacked, an insurer will step in, and once the ransom is paid, the insurer will reimburse the cost of the ransom. So, for example, if you, if your ship owner from Denmark, for example, your ship gets hijacked, you will normally have your insurers will get involved. They will appoint a professional hostage negotiator, and that person will negotiate a ransom with the pirates. There's quite a lot of bargaining, haggling. Basically, the pirates start off at maybe demanding 10 or even 20 million. The insurers say no way. Well, they'll offer a fraction of that, and they meet somewhere in between. But essentially the money is paid by the insurer, although not up front. What they do is they reimburse the cash once the owner has already paid it out.
So how do they actually get this money then to the pirates? It's not like they go, here's my PayPal, throw us over a cheeky $1 million. You know what I mean? Like, it's obviously some kind of procedure. How does that all happen?
Well, it varies. I mean, in the old days, sometimes, they would be given the owners would be given the number of a bank account somewhere, often in the Middle East or somewhere like that, a numbered bank account, and you just send the money there.
Really?
Some jurisdiction where people were not going to ask too many questions. But that, I think, was relatively rare. More often what would happen is that the money would be delivered in cash to the pirates on the ship. And so sometimes it would be delivered by a boat. Sometimes, more often, it would be delivered by an airdrop. You'd get a small plane flown by a bush pilot, usually people from mainly South Africans and Kenyans, people like that, would fly over the plane and drop the money in a suitcase or a holdall via a parachute, same kind of parachute people use for base jumping, stuff like that normally, and they would drop it on or near the plane, and the pirates would shoot out and pick it up. And that's generally how the majority of ransom drops were done. The people who would be supervising this are usually ex-military guys, often from Britain or South Africa or the US, and who are experienced in working in these, in hostile environments, and they would usually charge a pretty penny for their services. Quite often things did go wrong, but generally speaking, that was the way that the ransoms were dropped.
Right, that is fascinating. And what kind of people are the pirates? Like, this sounds like a whole network. It seems like a business. Who is it? Who are these pirates generally?
Well, the piracy really started in about, I think that the first reports of it were in the very late 90s or the early 2000s. And the story goes that at that time, Somalia, because it hadn't had a government then since about 1991, after the collapse of the then government, which was a Soviet-backed government, and their authority disappeared when the Soviet Union collapsed, basically, and the country lapsed into civil war. One of the side effects of that was that there was no policing of Somalia's coastline at all, which meant that the fish stocks there, which are very rich, lots of tuna and other fish, were open to anybody to come and poach. And so there was an increasing problem with vessels from Asia and Europe coming in and just helping themselves to all Somalia's fish. or a lot of it. This annoyed some of the local fishermen who felt that their stocks were being poached. And so the local fishermen formed what they used to call their own coast guards, which were basically sort of militia groups that would go out on boats, usually on little motorized skiffs, and they would attack these poaching foreign vessels as and when they saw them, usually just going aboard, robbing them, and delivering a bit of on-the-spot justice, really. And they used to give themselves names. They would call themselves like the Somali Coast Guard, or the Somali anti-poaching militia, various different names like that. And that is sort of where it's said to have started off. And a kind of folk myth built up around these people, that they were essentially Robin Hood type figures, robbing from the rich to give to the poor, just a sort of, a bit of vigilante justice levied out on these poaching foreign fishermen. However, it soon got out of hand. Word got round that there was quite a lot of money to be made doing this. And gradually, a lot of other people, a lot of other armed groups from Somalia began to get in on the act. And within a matter of a few years, they weren't just attacking passing fishing vessels, they were attacking basically any passing ship that came within reach. Hence, they were attacking cargo vessels, oil tankers, even ships carrying food for the World Food Programme. Aid that was actually destined for Somalia would sometimes get attacked. So the sort of Robin Hood thing, wore pretty thin fairly soon.
Yeah, I can see that. So maybe just take us through, like, step by step, how do the modern day pirates actually go about their business? From the shore to boarding the boat to then getting away. Like, how does that all happen?
So you use the word business. It is really like a business. You've got you have various different towns up and down the Somali coast. Certainly, 10, 15 years ago, places like Ale and Haradere and Hobyo, which are little isolated towns, not much more than villages, really, a long, long way from anywhere. Often a day or two's drive along a bumpy track. So very isolated places anyway. And these would be the places from where the pirate gangs would go out in search of vessels. And typically what would happen is that some guy, a clan chief or somebody like that, or a militia, a leader of a local militia would say, right, I'm going to put together a hijacking venture. I need maybe 10, 15, 20 guys. And then we need 2 or 3 skiffs, which are these little wooden sort of go fast boats with, a couple of big, high, 120 horsepower engines on the back. And off they would go in search of prey. And some local investor would often put up the money to send them out. Maybe the whole thing often used to only cost about maybe $10,000 for hiring the boat, the guys, the guns, and everything else. And they would go off in search of ships for 2 or 3 days at a time. And if they caught a ship, if they hijacked one, which was basically a case of just sailing up to the Gulf of Aden, which is just on the northern coast of Somalia, then they would board a ship and they would be off. One thing to point out is that the area where Somalia is, it's a sort of, Somalia is a kind of jagged, it's known as the Horn of Africa, which means it's got this sort of jagged triangle that sticks out into the Indian Ocean. It's got an enormous coastline of nearly 2,000 kilometers. And the Gulf of Aden, which is on the northern side, is where, a great deal of the world's shipping passes through. So it's basically like being Dick Turpin, the highwayman, and being stationed on the M1. You're perfectly positioned to prey on passing shipping. And then, so when they got a ship in sight, it was pretty simple, really. They would sail up 2 or 3 skiffs, and they could easily outpace most slow-moving tankers or whatever. and then they would get up close to the ship, and then they would get a big, long grappling ladder, which is basically a ladder sort of 10, 20 feet long, sometimes longer than that, with some grappling hooks on the other side, on the top end, and they cruise up close to the ship, chuck that on the side, and then clamber over, pretty much like the pirates of old in a way. Once they got on board, 2 or 3 guys with weapons, then that's pretty much it, over.
Right, and they jump on board. What kind of weapons do these groups have? Like, how are they able to just overpower everyone? Like,
well, you'd usually have, if say you had 3 skiffs attacking a ship at one time, you'd have maybe say 3 or 4 guys on each ship, on each skiff rather, each with a Kalashnikov, then 1 or 2 with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher as well. I don't think the RPGs were necessarily that effective, but if you're cruising, if you're the captain of an oil tanker, for example, and you see someone firing an RPG at you, a bloody big missile, you're going to be pretty scared that it's going to blow up your boat. So the RPGs are probably there more for fear factor than anything else. But then once they've got the guys on board, as I say, most of the crews in the old days were not armed. So as soon as you've got 1 or 2 men on board with AK-47s pointing them at the crew, that's it. That's game over. The crew will generally just, do what they're told. And in the majority of cases, their owners would be telling them, look, if this ever happens to you, do not put up any resistance. Just let the pirates take over, and then we'll worry about what happens afterwards.
So they're effectively militant groups on the seas, basically.
Basically, yes. I mean, didn't tend to have any political affiliations. It was always just about the money, and they were quite careful to make that clear most of the time. Oh,
they would, yeah.
Yeah, there was a reason for that. If they said, hey, we're doing this hijacking in the name of Al-Shabaab or some sort of terrorist group, then that made it a lot more difficult for the shipping companies to pay out ransoms, because this isn't true of every country, but in most cases, paying a ransom to a criminal group is not illegal. Paying a ransom to a group like Al-Shabaab is, certainly if you're in Britain or the US or anywhere else. So they were generally quite careful to say, no, we are just pirates, even if perhaps a bit of the money was occasionally going to some Al-Shabaab group that might be controlling a part of the territory where they operated on.
Right, that makes sense. And how successful were they? Like, were there any where they didn't get a ransom? And then what happens?
They were pretty successful at what they did between 2008 and 2012 or so, which was really the peak years of the piracy crisis. They hijacked about 150 ships. They attacked a whole lot more than that, but their hit rate was maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 10 or something. And they earned an estimated $500 million in ransoms from those ships combined, which is quite a lot of cash for a place as poor as Somalia was. Nobody has exact figures, because the shipping companies tend not to want to say how much was paid out, but there was enough times when pirates themselves would film the ransom being dropped, and then they would announce to all and sundry how much they got, because it was good for their sometimes good for their image as pirates to show how much they were earning. But yeah, it was a lot of money. Yeah.
No, definitely. And what happens though if they don't pay? Like, have they actually, they execute people?
I remember speaking to some negotiators who worked for some of the shipping companies, and they generally said one of the surprising things was that the Somali pirates were generally pretty businesslike, and they would haggle over the amount that was going to be paid for the ransom. But once it was agreed, then that was it. You paid the money up front, and then you got your hostages back. And the negotiators who worked for the insurance companies and the shipping companies were surprised at that, because a lot of them had previously worked in places like Latin America, where they'd worked with dealing with drug gangs or, kidnappers in that part of the world. And they said that the Somali pirates were surprisingly straightforward and easy to deal with. And they put that down to the Somalis just being quite smart business people and realizing that if they made it easy for a ransom to, if a ransom was paid and then they handed the hostages over, then that was just encouraging the ship owners to take the path of least resistance. Because, for most ship owners, these are Western business people sitting in places like Denmark or Holland or London. Paying ransoms is not normally part of their thing, and they just think that's just going to be chucking good money after bad. These guys are criminals, they won't give us the hostages back. But if word got round that the Somalis actually delivered on their side of the bargain, it became a much more attractive option than, say, just refusing to pay or hoping that some foreign navy would get involved or whatever. However, there were cases where the ransom didn't come forward for whatever reason. Occasionally, you would have ship owners who weren't properly insured, and yes, at that point, it did sometimes get nasty. The moment things started not going the pirates' way, there was quite a lot of instances of torture. All kinds of unpleasant stuff, the sort of thing you would imagine, used to happen on ships in the old days. People getting dumped over the side of the vessel, having their hands or legs tied up so that they couldn't swim, dangled in the water. People were getting made to lie out on the deck for hours or days on end with no food or water. People just getting beaten up, roughed up, having their fingernails pulled out with pliers. Being shut in the ship's deep freeze for 45 minutes after being stripped naked. There's some pretty unpleasant stuff going on. This was generally once the piracy crisis was in full flow, I would say. It didn't happen very much in the early days, but I think the longer the piracy crisis went on, the greedier some of the pirates got, and the more pressure they tried to apply on some of the ship owners. And you also got some very ruthless operators moving into the business. It sometimes reminded me of old school mafias, where you've got men of honor who had certain codes of conduct versus newcomers who just didn't care what they had to do as long as they got the money.
Right, yeah, same old. You mentioned earlier about how a lot of this got nipped in the bud when armed groups would be on board the ships as well. I've seen footage of private military contractor groups firing back at pirates, kidnapping the pirates after they've got on board, all sorts of madness. Explain to us how that all started happening.
Yeah, so to start off with, 2008, the piracy crisis starts, and you're getting crews taken hostage left, right, and centre. The insurers generally, though, did not want to get involved putting armed guards on ships because they were worried that if an armed guard shot a pirate or shot somebody who was innocent, for example, then there would be all kinds of legal problems. What they hoped was that this international anti-piracy force, which was dispatched to desert the area, would control the problem and eventually bring the pirates to book. 3 years in, that the anti-piracy force wasn't really having that much of an effect. The area was just too bloody big. You got an area half the size of the Indian Ocean. It's several times the size of Western Europe. And the more ships got taken, and the more violent the pirates got, the shipping industry basically sort of said, look, we can't rely on the navies to help us. We are going to have a rethink about armed guards. And really that's what happened. And then, so come about 2012, armed guards started being put on a lot of the ships. The rules were changed amongst the insurers, so it was no longer problematic from an insurance point of view. Most of them, ex-military, a lot of them had worked in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, Brits, Americans, people like that. And what they would normally do is they would stick a little machine gun nest, a sandbag machine gun nest at the end of a tanker or here and there on a ship's deck. And it was actually pretty effective because if they've got a group of Somali pirates coming towards them, bouncing around on a skiff, on the waves, in the ship's wake, the pirates will find it very hard to shoot straight. Whereas the Royal Marines or ex-Royal Marines who are on the ship, you've got a big tanker. It's very steady. It's basically like firing down from a fortress on a target. It's very easy. So all they would normally have to do really is fire a few warning shots, and that would be enough to get the pirates to go away.
Right. But there have been kind of controversies around some of these private military contractor groups on board these ships, right?
There's been a few. I mean, there's the odd bit of footage you see of groups of private military contractors shooting at people. It's often very hard to tell really why the people are there and whether they are genuinely pirates or just innocent fishermen who may have happened to stray too close. There's been one or two cases, I think in Taiwan. A private military contractor is currently going through the courts for shooting people. I think equally though, in that part of the world, out on the ocean where nobody can see you, I think probably quite a lot of the time the feeling was if you did hit a pirate and he was killed or injured, who was going to ask too many questions? Who was going to find out?
Yeah. And what kind of groups, what kind of people end up, on board these ships to protect them?
The ones I know are mainly ex-military guys from Britain, usually ex-Paras, ex-Royal Marines, people like that, people who've often got previous security experience working in somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan as a bodyguard, or who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan in the military. There's a whole sort of industry of those sort of people. These days, it's pretty much risen out of the war on terror, they around sort of the time the piracy crisis started, which is sort of 2008, they were finding it increasingly difficult to operate in places like Iraq. So all of a sudden, there was quite a lot of spare manpower. Then the other thing that made it easier for them, though, was that they came up with this idea of floating armories. So you would have these little these little sort of floating, usually a boat floating somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean in international waters, just loaded to the gunwales with weaponry. And so a ship would, before it was going into the pirate, the area where the pirates operated, a ship would stop there, and the security guards on board would then stock up with their weapons at that point, and then they would have them for the duration of the journey through the pirate-plagued area, and then they would stop at another floating armory at the other end and drop the weapons off. And what that did was it got around the problem of going in and out of different ports with weapons, because every country has different paperwork for weapons. Some allow people to be armed, some of them don't. I'd say probably the majority of them don't. And that made it very difficult for the ships, because if they were in port and somebody was found to be carrying a weapon without the correct paperwork, the whole ship could get impounded and there'd be all sorts of legal problems. But as long as you had these floating armories out in international waters, you could carry the weapons, drop them off, and then there would be no difficulties in between. I think also in terms of shipping economics, you're talking about a ship that's maybe, $50,000 a day running costs. You could buy 3 or 4 AK-47s for $250 each, and at the end of a journey of maybe 3.5 weeks, you chuck them overboard if needs be. It's a pittance in comparison to the overall shipping economics. So that was kind of how they got around the problem of not being allowed weapons.
Yeah, these floating armories I've read about before. A friend of mine actually, he made a documentary about them. They're absolutely fascinating. For our listeners, just explain who is funding these floating armories. Like, how do you get permission to just have, a floating armory? It sounds mad.
I'll be honest, I don't actually know, but most of them, as far as I'm aware, were private ventures run by private security companies who, often, as I said, often already got a foothold in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, staffed mainly by ex-British and ex-American or ex-South African military personnel. I mean, they would, I think a lot of them would probably have a financial backer of some sort. And I mean, it's a good question. Who on earth would allow anybody just to sit in the middle of the Indian Ocean with a boat loaded with weapons? I think they enjoyed the cooperation, either sort of tacit, unofficial or otherwise, of the international shipping industry, which wanted these people to be able to have these weapons. And they probably also tried to be as above board as possible, and they would have liaised with the different international navies and so on to say, look, here we are, this is what we're doing, by all means come and inspect us as you want. We would like you to know where we are, because the last thing we want is a bunch of terrorists coming in, grabbing all the weapons. But if I'm absolutely honest, I'm speculating slightly as to sort of how exactly these things operated, but that is my understanding of roughly how it did.
And you yourself, you were kidnapped, right? You were held ransom by Somali pirates whilst reporting. Tell us about that if you can.
Well, yeah, this was back in 2008. I was working for the Sunday Telegraph at the time on the foreign desk. I was one of their London-based foreign correspondents, basically just traveling around the world covering different stories. So when the piracy crisis started, in about October 2008 or so, the pirates hijacked a big Saudi oil tanker, brand new oil tanker, worth $100 million, carrying $150 million worth of oil. It also had two Brits on board who were crew members. So this was a big story. It was like the equivalent of pirates back in the Elizabethan times hijacking a Spanish galleon full of gold or something like that. It was kind of treasures beyond the pirates' wildest dreams. So at that point, the officer said to me, "Can you go to Somalia and do a bit of reporting on the ground? Just to get an idea of how the pirates operated and and also what the local people thought of them." I'd been to Somalia once before, to Mogadishu, which is in the sort of south central Somalia, not the bit that the pirates are operating in. That's more in the north. But that kind of qualified me as the sort of office expert on Somalia, just having been there the once. It wasn't a place that people went to very often. So off we went. And we went to a town called Bosaso, which is on the northern coast, which was where the piracy was operating. You can actually fly. You can fly to Bosaso from Djibouti and Dubai and places like that. But it's a pretty rundown place. There's not just the piracy. You don't actually see pirates operating openly in Bosaso, but you see a lot of evidence of pirate money. You see sort of brand new villas going up and people cruising around in SUVs. It's a bit like going to some place where there's a lot of drug trafficking going on. You don't see the trade openly, but you sort of see the telltale signs.
Bit of a Casablanca vibe.
Yeah. So we went there. There's not just piracy going on there. There's all sorts of other maritime criminality as well, people trafficking, arms trafficking, all sorts of other stuff. Obviously, but by that stage, the piracy was already kind of in full swing. And one of the unfortunate side effects was that the piracy was essentially a kidnapping epidemic at sea. But that kidnapping ethos was also spreading to the land. So, as a foreigner, you were in Bosaso, you were an automatic potential target for kidnapping. So what people used to do would be to hire armed bodyguards, local people. You'd usually hire 5 or 6 of them, just guys with guns. And pretty much everybody did that. It didn't matter whether you were, a journalist, businessmen, aid worker, pretty much everybody. We used to just hire, a few blokes with guns to sort of ostensibly protect you from kidnapping. Now, these are not sort of the kind of bodyguards who are going to lay their lives down for you. They're usually your interpreters, friends, or cousins friends, or something like that. You pay them about $20 a day each, and they each have a Kalashnikov, and they travel in a vehicle, that follows yours. The reason for paying them really is they're essentially kind of scarecrows, if you like. It's to make people think twice about kidnapping you. It also, if you try and opt not for having armed bodyguards, then something is more likely to happen to you as well. It's a bit like protection money, or if you've ever been to a football ground where you get a kid saying, "Can I mind your car for you, mister?" It used to be an old scam when I was young. It's that kind of thing. If you don't pay the kid to mind your car for you, you'll find your car gets scratched later on. So we had a group of these bodyguards, and we were in Bosaso for about a week. The bodyguards had been hired by the local fixer that we had. Then on the very last day that we were there, the bodyguards got changed. We got a different bunch, and we didn't really think anything of it because we'd been having some problems with the previous set. They hadn't been turning up on time and stuff. We headed to the airport that day. There was my colleague and I, Jose, who was a photographer from Spain, who was with me, a freelance photographer. We were in one pickup truck, and the bodyguards were in the other, about 7 of them. We were driving through the outskirts of Bosaso, this town, and then all of a sudden the bodyguards' pickup truck shot in front of ours, and the bodyguards all jumped out, started waving their guns and shouting. And because they were shouting in Somali, I didn't understand what was going on at first. I thought maybe they were just having a bit of a row about which route to go or something like that, and being rather voluble. But then they ran up to the car doors, jerked the car doors open, ordered us out at gunpoint, and sort of started pushing us. And I suddenly thought, oh shit, we are getting kidnapped. And it literally was like that. It's just this sort of sudden realization. Yeah. Fucking hell, this has been planned all along by the people who've been looking after us. Jesus Christ, and then they opened the boot of the car and told us to get our stuff out, and gestured at us to get into into their vehicle instead. At the time, we were in a sort of a built-up area. There was, a sort of suburb of Bosaso, and with hindsight, part of me thinks that if I tried to sort of create a commotion or something, or made a run for it, you could have, attracted a crowd of people, and maybe the bodyguard, the kidnappers would have lost their nerve. But, basically, for me anyway, the moment someone's got a gun pointed at your stomach, you're just like, nope, okay, you tell me, I'll do whatever you say.
You don't mess about, yeah.
Yeah, and they could have said, can you change this tyre as well, or pump the tyres up on the car because they're a bit flat. I'd have been, yeah, whatever, yeah. So they bundled us into their vehicle, and then we drove off out of town at sort of top speed, and then into a sort of desert area just outside of town. And I remember we were it was full of sand dunes, really, really hilly. But I remember the driver sort of driving over them like a rally, a kind of rally pace. And boy, this guy could really drive. I remember thinking, like, fucking hell, if I tried to drive like that, I'd be all over the shop. And, we had one kidnapper sat in the back. And I remember thinking, like, shall I try and, now is the time to do something before we get too far from town. Should I try and lean forward and sort of grab the wheel so the car turns over and, they all get out slightly dazed, and then we run off, and then you think, no, that's just fantasy stuff.
Yeah, that's just Tintin.
Yeah, or the A-Team or something like that, So, off we went to this sort of set of mountains. We probably drove for about 3/4 of an hour, and then up into this mountain canyon. and we got to a point where the car could drive no further. They jumped us out the car, and then we started walking up this mountain track. And that was sort of where our kind of kidnapping kind of experience began, really.
And how do they treat you then?
Well, we were at this point, we didn't really know what they were, why they were kidnapping us or anything like that, or even if that was the intention. We got about halfway up this track. We came to this clearing, and they suddenly stopped. And I suddenly thought, well, shit, I'm assuming these guys are just, kidnapping us. But what if this is like some sort of terrorist group and this is a sort of execution, and then one of them sort of dug in his bag and pulled out some Mars bars and some water. And he kind of gestured at us and said, oh, eat, drink, or whatever. I said, he was like a scoutmaster or something on a scout trip. And then we suddenly realized, well, they obviously want to keep some so we then basically walked. We were sort of route marched, flat, solid, getting very tired, very caves where they kept us for the next 6 weeks. And generally speaking, they treated us okay. They didn't try and sort of torture us or anything like that. But obviously, it's a very sort of frightening experience. I mean, not least of all because we were stuck. It was in Somalia, and you're sort of thinking like, how on earth is anybody going to get us out? There's no government here. There's no foreign troops like there are in Iraq or Afghanistan. The nearest British embassy is in Kenya, 1,500 miles away. You feel like you might as well be on another planet.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds scary. You said 6 weeks they held you for.
Yeah, I mean, they demanded money. About 5 days in, they took us up to the top of a mountain, made a mobile phone call to my office at the Telegraph, and they said, right, we want $3 million for you and $3 million for your fellow hostage, a Spanish guy. And I remember thinking that's quite a lot of money for someone like me, But I mean, in a sense, it was a relief because I'd previously worked in Iraq a lot, where if you got kidnapped, there was a high likelihood that they would make some political demand that they knew was going to be impossible for the British government to meet, like withdraw troops tomorrow or something like that. And if that demand was not met, then you would be beheaded, and we saw that happen numerous times in Iraq. So for them just to be asking for money was a big relief. The office said no. The Telegraph said no. We don't want to pay money. We don't think it's appropriate for journalists to be kidnapped in the first place. And they did their best to try and secure our release through sort of diplomatic means and through sort of trying to bring pressure on, local clan chiefs and religious leaders and so on, saying, look, it's bad for your country and the image of your country if any foreigner who goes there gets kidnapped. It will mean that aid workers and investors and all sorts of other people will stay away. I do not know exactly what the circumstances were of that led to our release. The office appointed an outside team of professional negotiators, and that they, one of the conditions of their that they set is that do not disclose any details of how we work. It's like playing a game of poker, very high stakes poker for people's lives. And what you do is you always show a poker face, and one thing you never do is give away, your tactics or the hand that you play. But what I do know is that, we were released after only 6 weeks, which by Somali standards is not long. I know of other hostages who have been held there for a year, 2 years, 3 years even, and sometimes longer than that. So we got off pretty damn lucky, really.
Yeah, that sounds like quite an experience. Before we go, tell us about this new book you've got out, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea.
Yeah, well, I was just saying we got off luckily. other people did not. And after my experience of being held hostage and stuff, I kept a close eye on the piracy story, and it gradually became clear that while most ships were ransomed out after a bit, there was a few that weren't. 3 ships in particular that were all ended up being stuck for 3, 4, and even 5 years in captivity. And I remember sort of following the progress of the various hijackings, and it became clear that these ships had been stuck there for years on end. And I sort of did some research on why this was, because it wasn't really in the public domain very much, because ship owners never comment publicly on the progress of ransom negotiations. But it became apparent after a while that none of the owners of these 3 ships had kidnap and ransom insurance, and therefore they couldn't pay the ransoms that the pirates were asking for, which was, and as a result, these ships just languished there. You might expect that I think the owners hoped that the pirates would eventually just get fed up and let the hostages go, but that is not what Somali pirates do. There's not much money in that country, and once they've got what they think is going to be a jackpot, they don't lightly give it up. To make matters worse for these particular hostages, the pirates assumed that when the owners told them they didn't have any money, they thought that was just a kind of negotiating tactic on the part of the owner, a rather callous negotiating tactic. And so they kind of responded in kind. They started torturing all the crews to, try and increase the pressure on the owners. And, in some cases, on one ship, one sailor was executed, shot dead in cold blood, and the rest of his fellow crewmates were, just tortured relentlessly over periods of months. All sorts of horrific stuff going on. On another ship, they put them on starvation diets. So 6 of the crew starved to death. Basically, they got a vitamin deficiency condition called beriberi, which makes your limbs swell up hideously, and then eventually stops your heart working. You had these guys, I think in all about 45, 50 seafarers stuck in this fashion on 3 different ships, none of whose owners could pay, and nothing was happening. The owners weren't getting them out. The governments weren't doing anything. They're mainly governments from very poor countries like Cambodia, Bangladesh, places like that, where the governments don't have much capacity, and there was no naval force coming in to get them out either. The British and American navies had special forces in the area that did occasionally do rescues of ships held hostage at sea, but they would only generally do them for their own citizens, because the risk to the soldiers as well as the hostages was too high. And eventually, a former British Army officer, a guy called John Steed, who used to be the military attaché in Nairobi, who was working for the UN on counter-piracy issues at the time, he became aware of these 3 ships' plight, and he took it upon himself, really, basically because nobody else was doing anything, to free them. And initially his hope was that he would just try and get some aid packages through the offices of the UN to these various ships, some medicines and so on, relief supplies, and eventually build up a rapport with the pirates so that you could then turn the conversation to, look, these guys, there's no ransom money for them. Why don't you just, let them go, do the decent thing? And unfortunately, the pirates said, well, no, sorry, we can't do that because we are in debt ourselves. And because they've been looking after these ships for so long, paying teams of 20 gunmen, maybe, $10 a day each to look after them. After 3 years, that debt ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, which they owed to other pirate clans. Didn't just owe it to some high street bank manager. And they said, look, we'd be happy to let these guys go for free, but we need a ransom because, we're in debt ourselves now. And so this guy, John Steed, he raised money privately to get these ships freed, which was not as easy as you might expect. You might think that there's a sort of Sir Richard Branson type, some billionaire philanthropist who would step in and just write a check, but most philanthropists don't want to get involved in paying ransoms. It's bad for the image. Nobody likes to be seen to be writing checks for criminals. So he had to raise the money himself. It took a long time, but he did eventually do it. And thanks to his efforts, 3 ships' crews of about 50 hostages in total are now walking around as free men when they might otherwise still be stuck there.
Right, and he managed to save these people, right? What kind of operation was that like?
Well, first of all, he had to negotiate sort of a price, for the hostages. And what he did was quite cleverly. He said, "Well, look, I can't pay the multi-million-dollar ransoms that you're asking for, but you've talked about running up some expenses of a few $100,000. What if I pay your expenses?" And that served a couple of purposes. That meant he could sort of try and kind of say to would-be donors, like, I'm not really after a ransom. This is just to pay the pirates' expenses and get them off, and get them to agree to release the hostages. And it also meant he could barter them down to a much more realistic sum. But it was still very difficult raising the money. And at one point, he was contacted by this guy, a German sea captain, who was offering to provide him with about $900,000 from a German seafarers union. That meant John thought he had enough to strike a deal with one of the ships. So he went as far as striking a deal for the hostages for about $900,000 or so. Then went back to the sea captain to ask him for the money, actually to get the cash transferred. And at that point, the sea captain kept on offering excuses, and eventually it transpired this guy was not a sea captain at all. He was some sort of con man, and what he was hoping for, he managed to get some emails and various paperwork off John. What he was hoping to do was go around himself with some of the paperwork from the hostage rescue mission to various people saying, "Hey, look, I'm collecting money for this on behalf of this guy," and then presumably was planning just to pocket the money himself. John eventually found out about that just very shortly before he was due to press ahead with the deal, and suddenly he's in a position where he's got no money at all, and he had to break the news to the pirates. To the hostages that they weren't going to be able to go home, and also to the pirates that there was going to be no deal. And this was a group of pirates who had already executed a hostage when the owner of the ship had failed to pay up and tortured lots of others. So he thought, Jesus Christ, if I tell them that I've not got the money, how many other people are they going to kill? He had no choice but to be honest with them. And actually, luckily, he went to them and he said, "Look, I'm sorry, but I've been conned." And somewhat to his surprise, I mean, they were angry, but they understood that because apparently in their world, in the world of Somali pirates and criminals, con men are a kind of an occupational hazard. So I think they kind of went, "Oh, yeah, all right, fair enough. We can understand that." Whereas if he'd said the money's been held up because of banking regulations in London or something like that, if he'd lied, they'd have, that's not something they had an experience of. They'd have said, "No, you're lying, mate," But a con man, it's like, yeah, we can see that. They still gave the crew a roughing up, but they didn't kill any others. And that was something that, he was absolutely terrified about because, he was doing this mission off his own bat. He was not a trained hostage negotiator. And there was quite a lot of people saying, "Look, this is not a job for amateurs. You want to be very careful here because once you get into hostage negotiation, once you start talking money with people like pirates, you're talking their game. And that is the moment at which they start playing with their tactics and sort of saying, like, if you're not offering them enough money, or the money they want, that's when they start torturing people. That's when people start getting killed. So, if you go down that route, you are going down where you may end up with a situation where, because of something you did or said, these pirates, who are pretty excitable at the best of times anyway, start killing people, and then that's on your conscience. And on this occasion, he thought, they might end up killing people because simply because of something he had said. Simply because he'd not been able to come up with the money. So, it's a big responsibility, to take on. And then eventually, on that occasion, he didn't have, he didn't have anything like the money he needed after this, German fella failed to deliver the goods. So he had about $200,000. The pirates wanted far more than that, and eventually he hatched a deal with the lead pirate on the ship, who was also fed up by this time after about 3 years. And he said, "Look, if you can stage an escape, I will pay you all the money I've got, $200,000. But you need to stage an escape so that the rest of the hostages can go, and just cut the rest of the gang out the deal." And that is basically what they did. So he went down the route of basically agreeing with one pirate to rip off a whole lot of other pirates, which is certainly a gamble and not out of the kind of hostage negotiators rule book, as you might say.
Yeah, that sounds like a very wild story. Where can people get this book and get in contact with you and stuff like that?
It's called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, the mission to rescue the hostages the world forgot. And it's by Icon Books. It's $16.99. That's the hardback. But if there's a paperback coming out next year that's a lot cheaper.
And where can people find you online, on Twitter or wherever like that?
Best reached via Twitter on Colin Freeman 99, and then I also write occasionally, or still, for the Telegraph quite a bit. And I have a web page as well. It's just my own blog. The link to it is on my Twitter feed.
Okay, mate. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen. Take care, mate.
That was Colin Freeman speaking about modern day armed piracy on the seas and all that entails. Definitely check his book out. It's very interesting. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. There's loads of bonus episodes there. There are about 2 a month. I think we've got almost 100 bonus episodes now. So there's a lot of stuff there for you waiting. Also, you get regular episodes early, access to the community Discord, merchandise, discount codes, narrated articles, access to the Too Cool for J School series, and we will be doing another I don't want to say documentary series. We're going to be doing a series soon coming to the Patreon, which will basically be kind of looking into some of the world's most obscure militant groups. It'd be kind of a graphic led thing, but yeah, that'll be coming to the patreon.com/popularfront. Thank you very much to our sponsors on this episode. They are Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA, an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue, 97239. Be sure to tell them Popular Front sent you. Thank you to Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA, one in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. The episode's also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. Buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use the promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. And check out the limited run of Popular Front prints that are up there. Some of our photo work from across various different conflict zones. Propagandopolis.com. If you want to follow us on social media, Twitter is at PopularFrontCO, Instagram at popular.front. YouTube, youtube.com/popularfront, the website popularfront.co, merchandise popularfront.shop. If you want to follow me anywhere, it's at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN, same as my website, jakehanrahan.com. You can get in touch that way. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Thank you very much to our high tier Patreons. They are Elise Middlefar, Jess, David McManus, Joaquim Williamson Holt, Yode Travis, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Kate Ellen, Dan Ross, Thumper, Lisa Milgram, Bradley Davies, Brendan Crave, Peter Hesher, RX, A. Nicole, Travis Lieberman, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, MJ, Meredith Waters, Adam H, Larson 8669, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Jacob, Michael O'Connor, Zach Picard, Todd Cravens, Alexander, Nicholas Butter, Ron Swanson, JD, Jav, Ian Froese, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Fitzmadrid, Ed Coulthard, Clayton Taylor, Mike Barone, Ben, Liam Williams, Chris Cusimano, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Noah Ease, Christina Ravetti, Freya Northman, Ali Hunter, Moody Al Rashid, Bill Wilson, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Anthony Kobarek, Dan Dunham, Fletcher, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbul. Thank you all very much. If you want to support us, go to patreon.com/popularfront or popularfront.co/support.